welcome back. We are coming to the part of the celebration, the Bernhard Harms Prize. Dear Ambassador Steinlein, dear Silvana, dear Ken, dear distinguished guests, it's a great honor for me, Moritz Schularick, the president of the Kiel Institute, to start now the celebration for the Kiel Institute's Bernhard Harms Prize that has been awarded to distinguished scholars in international economics since 1964. So it's one of the longest standing and most important prizes in Europe. It's named after Bernhard Harms, who's the founder of our institute. He founded the Kiel Institute 111 years ago. You can make the math which year that was. It's not a good year. But it's one that now in these terms we, I think, has, from a European perspective, look back and know, hopefully, where to go forward. Harms, he founded the Institute, I said this, and also he did a very smart thing. He also founded a Society for the Advancement of the Kiel Institute, which is a little bit our club that supports our work, and that society sponsors the prize, and we're very grateful for them. Recent winners or awardees of the Harms Prize include someone who sits just there, Elaine Ray, but also Gita Gopinath, Lord Nicholas Stern, Carmen Reinhardt, and many others, and we're very happy today to add Silvana Tenreyro to this list of really outstanding personalities. Silvana is the James E. Mead Professor of Economics at the London School of Economics and a pioneer in research on economic volatility, monetary policy transmission, and currency unions. And I mean, we are extremely grateful as well to Ken Rogoff, who is here to tell us more about her outstanding work and why Silvana is this fantastic figure in international economics, an important figure today. Ken is a professor at Harvard University, former chief economist of the IMF, grandmaster in chess, among many other things, and a winner of the Bernhard Harms Prize in 2008. Dear Ken, thanks for making it, thanks for being here, and the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Moritz, and thank you to everyone for being here. It's a great honor to present this honor, and it's really, you just said I won it, but I have to say sort of a who's who of international economics following Gita Gopinath and Elaine Ray. I mean, these are two rock stars. By the way, I have almost a chapter devoted to Elaine in my book, so you can see that I really mean that. And Gita as well. I mean, this is really an incredible prize. And I have to congratulate the Kiel Institute for wrapping it with this conference. I have to say, when I won it, it wasn't like this. It was in Kiel, and actually all I really remember is that I won the right to teach a course at Kiel or something like that. But it was fantastic. So Silvana was my graduate student. I was on her thesis committee. She took my course, and I think actually your first really big paper grew out of that course of looking at gravity models and trade. I think I'll get to a moment about where she's gone, but I think everybody saw she was brilliant and the work was brilliant. Everybody saw that, but she was very unassuming, let's say, like she didn't want to present herself as being brilliant. And I think those of you who are there in the business know that that is very difficult to do. Like, to a certain point, you have to, say this work's really important. Everybody should think it's really important, because if you're not thinking that, it's very hard to get somebody to say it for you. And what's been so wonderful of watching her develop as a scholar, policymaker, is she's still very modest and unassuming, but gets her point across. somebody who says some very revolutionary things very forcefully. I think I'll talk about the economics, but probably a lot of you know her from when she was on the Bank of England, where she was not a yes man on the Bank of England, and she was very articulate in saying why things should be different, why people should be doing something else, and in a very constructive way. That's I think very important as a policymaker. So she has one paper that's, especially if you combine it with the follow-up, just a monster in citations. The one paper, almost 10,000 citations, and other papers, almost 12,000 citations. It's a fundamental methodological paper, and the honor to and the website makes this. But I actually think a lot of her best work has come later. I mean, there's nothing that's a methodological advance. I'll talk about some of the other papers, but I'm going to start with what I think is really amazing. So she has a new paper, she's going to talk about it, that's in the Quarterly Journal of Economics, which is very contrarian to the profession. So there had emerged this consensus that sort of maybe started with Dornbusch and Krugman in the mid-'80s and followed through into much further work with Oleg Itskoki and Dmitry Mukin, Gita Gopinath, Roberto Rigobon, many others, of a model where everything was monopolistic competition, monopoly was everything, everything was about markups, everything was about pass-through. And then I would say relatedly, there's a literature on how things are, how prices are set. Are they set in the producer's currency? So if you're French and you're exporting to the United States, are they set in euro? Are they set in the local currency? Are they set in dollars? Or as has sort of become a very dominant strand of thinking, that they're basically either set in euros or dollars anywhere in the world, that this something called dominant currency pricing. There's I was a co-editor with Gita Gopinath and Elkanan Helpman of the Handbook of International Economics, the most recent edition, just a couple years ago. There's a whole paper sort of announcing this is a solved problem, this is where it is. And of course, Oleg Itskoki got the Clark Medal just a few years ago for a theory really built around that. It's beautiful. It's very, very beautiful work. And I had seen a paper of Silvana's that she'd written that I would describe as a thought piece, this paper, where she was saying, not so fast. You know what? There are a lot of things that are not monopolistic competition, that they're competitive markets. And not just commodities, but there are many goods that are commoditized. And you can't think about them the same way. It's completely different how prices pass through from exchange rate, how exchange rates pass through to prices, how prices are set. And I actually been teaching that paper in my graduate course for a while, and I don't know how long that's been kicking around, for 10 years or something like that. I don't know, she'll tell us. But it was sort of a thought piece. It was clearly she was onto something, but she hadn't, put it all together. And in this Quarterly Journal of Economics paper, she does. So some of the things that she and her co-authors show are, first of all, yes, a huge percentage of goods are competitive. And if you go to emerging markets, it's well over 60%. And you can say, somebody can say, well, my exchange rate paper wasn't intended to apply to Australia and New Zealand and Chile, and it was for Japan and the United States. But you wouldn't see that in any of the literature at that point, narrowing it to that. And that was already radical. But then further, she shows that it is actually these goods that are most often priced in the dominant currencies, the dollar mostly, or the euro. But if you go to the monopolistic competition goods, They're not. They're much more in what we call producer currency pricing. And okay, there's lots of, if you were at the National Bureau of Economic Research Summer Institute, certain years, there were wars over, what it was. And I'll actually say Maury Obstfeld and I, in our book in 1995, had what was then the predominant view of producer currency pricing. That was Mundell. And that kind of had lost out, first to local currency pricing and then dominant currency pricing. And and there's a lot more to be said. I mean, she finds something different. So aside from the work being very elegant, I think some of you are young scholars, know it's not easy to say the opposite of what the powers that be say in the profession. It's very hard to get your paper published when you're doing that. You generate a lot of negative feedback, and there are lots of examples of this. There's some papers written that are meta studies looking at working papers versus published papers and finding how often the published papers have a result very sympathetic to the couple leading scholars in the field, and the other papers, which in some cases turn out to be right, just couldn't get published. So anyway, this is a very nice piece of work, and I think very important in the field, and it's going to generate a lot of discussion. I've mentioned the work on gravity models, where it influenced not only the topic she was looking at, but actually much more broadly research on gravity models and gravity models of trade rule in the empirical literature and trades. It's been very impactful. She actually covers a lot of topics. So there's some people who work on, one or two topics, and you can decide which two papers you're going to talk about on those topics. But she actually does a lot of topics, and I can't really give justice to all of them. Certainly, she was very early on having a paper explaining why the Phillips curve was broken. So I don't know how exposed you are, or it's too in the weeds, but all the Phillips curves, the trade-off between prices and inflation and growth, or inflation and unemployment, that the Fed looks at and everybody looks at, and everybody had decided to some significant extent in the literature, but also definitely in the policy world, the press, it was gone. The correlation was gone. And she was very early on in pointing out that's because we didn't used to have monetary policy rules where when unemployment was really high, you would allow inflation to go up because you're having that trade-off, and vice versa, giving you the opposite correlation to what this Phillips curve said. And kind of, I don't know if it completely solved the question, but it was certainly a very important contribution. And actually, very importantly, from my remarks this morning about how everyone's forgotten political economy, she wants to write a paper that actually applies to the world as it is, not as we want to see it. And political economy is woven into that paper, and she shows her result holds whether or not you ignore those problems. I could go on to other things. For example, she has a couple of papers where she looks at seasonality as actually being a big deal, and one with another former student of mine, Giovanni Olivier. I'm giving this example, but there are a few along these lines, found that the effectiveness of monetary policy in the United States is seasonal. Who knew? And so it's not that the demand for money is seasonal. It's that when you cut the interest rate, how much good does it do? That's seasonal. And the logic, as I teach my students, and actually people who don't work in monetary and who are lay people have very hard time getting their head wrapped around that if prices and wages were flexible, no one would care what the Federal Reserve did. If everything was flexible, it would have, it could control the inflation rate, but it couldn't control much else. It'd have no real effect. I'll just throw that out there. Everyone's indexing, oh, thank you, and reacting. I have to say my thesis advisor, Rudy Dornbush, once told me the story about he was in Brazil and, you know, he got, you know, some, I can't, dysentery or some horrible thing that made him sick for a month. I said, how did it happen? And he said, well, I was speaking and somebody saw I needed water and gave me a glass of water. But I'll take a chance. And in France. And so the result in this paper is that when you do a monetary policy and interest rate cut at the end of the year, it doesn't do much because everybody's getting their wages and contracts changed at the end of the year. It's much less effective than at other times of year. And she has other papers about housing and other things very elegantly done. I should come back to her as a policymaker because she spent, was it 5 years at the Bank of England while continuing somehow to do research during this period. And I think she said she was there during 4 prime ministers, 6 chancellors. It was definitely, you know, a very difficult period in policymaking in the UK, and I think she'll be remembered as very effective. Maybe Mark Carney will invite you to be head of the Bank of Canada, you know, or something out of this, because I'm sure Mark remembers her very well from that. So anyway, I'm just going to finish congratulating you for, you know, an amazing and continuing achievements with seemingly like the best is still coming.
Nice words, and now it is my great pleasure and honor to, I need a third arm, but to award the 2025 Bernhard Prize to Silvana Tenreyro. Silvana, congratulations.
Well, thank you very, very much. Let me start with Ken. Thank you. Thanks for that generous laudation. And of course, I feel very, very lucky to have been your student and have had you as an advisor. It's been really amazing. I'd like to thank the Kiel Institute and the award committee. I'm really honored and grateful, also surprised. And yeah, this is fantastic. And I'd like to share my prize with my co-authors over the years. Miklos Koren, Giovanni Olivei, Joao Santos Silva, Francesco Caselli, Thomas Rextel, Michael McGlee, Greg Thwaites, Tiloka de Silva, Rachel Guy, and many others. It's been a great journey to work with them, and I learned a lot from them. And through that journey, actually, CPR has been a big presence, so I'm very thankful to CPR as well. It's been truly important in working on those papers and getting them through. And since I'm at it, I'd like to also thank my advisors from grad school, Ken, Robert Barrow, and Alberto Alessina, who left us too early. They've been always very patient with me. And I'd also like to thank my advisor from Argentina, Victor Elias, who's also not with us now, but he's been a big reason for why I'm here. And last but not least, my partner, Francesco Caselli, who's been amazing. Okay, so my talk today is about dollar dominance and the transmission of monetary policy, and Ken has already giving you a teaser for that. This is joint work with Malcolm McLeay from the Bank of England, and the usual disclaimers apply. This is, represents our views and not those of the bank. So the question that we address in this paper is in some ways an old one. Can monetary policy help stabilize the economy in a world of dollar dominance? That is, when countries use the dollar as a main currency for invoicing in international trade transactions. And let me give you some background for that question. As we learned from the work of Linda Goldberg, Cedric Thiel, Gita Gopinath, and many others since, a large share of international trade transactions is invoiced in US dollars. Even though trade with the United States is just around 15% of global trade, more than 50% of international trade transactions are invoiced in dollars. And this is illustrated in this chart. The green bars here shows the value of exports invoiced in US dollars as a share of a country's total exports, and the red bars show the value of exports to the United States as a share of a country's total exports. As you can see, I mean, somewhere in the, well, I cannot reach with this, sorry. But so, for example, for a country like France, about 10% of its exports would go to the United States, but more than 20% of French exports are invoiced in US dollars. For Latin American countries like Argentina or Brazil, the share of exports invoiced in dollars is in the order of nearly 100%. Even though trade with the United States for Brazil is well below 20%, for Argentina is less than 10%. Now, this dominance of the dollar in international trade transactions has led to a new paradigm, the dominant currency pricing paradigm, that has been shifting policy views. The inference that has been drawn in this paradigm is that dollar pricing makes exports unresponsive to exchange rates, that reduces the value of flexible exchange rates as automatic stabilizers or shock absorbers, and limits the effectiveness of monetary policy, reducing the gains from having an independent monetary policy. And the implication for policy suggested by institutions like the IMF or the BIS is that exchange rates, given that they do not act as shock absorbers and have limited impact on the trade balance, at least in the short run, should be replaced or complemented by other policy tools. Now, why did this paradigm reach this very strong conclusion? Well, there are two critical assumptions underlying the thinking. The first one is that exporters have monopoly power. And the second is that prices are sticky, and within this paradigm, they're sticky in US dollars. If prices are sticky in dollars, that means that an exchange rate depreciation or appreciation doesn't change the price in dollars. And with downward sloping demands, if the price doesn't change, the quantity demanded doesn't change. So there's no expenditure switching in this paradigm, and exchange rate change doesn't move quantities. Now, we argue in this paper with Michael McLeay that these two joint assumptions are not really borne out by the data. The use of the dollar is much more prevalent in homogeneous goods markets where prices tend to be flexible. Indeed, in many developing and emerging markets, producers tend to be flexible price takers. They export commodities or fairly homogeneous goods in which they have limited market power. And even when there is market power, actually those prices of homogeneous goods tend to be very flexible. Think about commodities as the quintessential example. And when we move to advanced economy, again, producers face very elastic demand and flexible prices in those homogeneous goods sectors. Where we see differentiated goods instead, actually producer currency pricing tends to prevail. And that's the type of model emphasized in Rogoff, which formalizes some of the intuitions in Milton Friedman's case for flexible exchange rates. Now, I will go through these arguments now in more detail. I was asked not to show any math, so I won't, but I have 3 graphs that hopefully will not be too mathy and will get to emphasize the point. So this first graph illustrates the logic underlying the dominant currency paradigm. So we have a monopolist exporter here, which faces a downward sloping demand curve and an upward sloping marginal cost curve. This monopolist sets the price, optimizing its profits, and the key assumption here is that that price is sticky in US dollars. So what happens when there is a depreciation of the exchange rate in this model? Well, costs would fall, the marginal cost curve will shift downwards, and here the implicit assumption is that there are some costs like labor costs or other non-tradable inputs whose prices tend to be sticky in the producer currency prices. So when there is a depreciation, those costs tend to fall when expressed in dollar terms. Now, this monopolist in principle would like to lower the price and expand its sales, but by assumption, the price is sticky, so the price doesn't move, the quantity demanded doesn't move, and in that sense, exchange rate depreciation don't have any effect on quantities. Now, what this model misses is that a large share of emerging and developing countries, which are incidentally the main users of the dollar in international trade transactions, tend to be commodity exporters. And these commodity exporters, I mean, here is an extreme case of a commodity exporter facing a perfectly elastic demand. And so the question is here again, what happens if there is a depreciation of the currency? Well, again, we see a fall in costs when expressed in dollar terms. The price in equilibrium, as you can see here, doesn't change either. It appears sticky. But quantities expand, and expand potentially by a lot, given this large elasticity of demand. So we call this model the mixed currency pricing calibration. So it's a calibration in which we have flexible export prices and sticky domestic prices. It can be sticky wages or other non-tradable inputs, and there is a lot of evidence for that in the literature. And I want to stress the point here that the literature had interpreted this lack of pass-through from exchange rates to prices as evidence of sticky prices in dollars. Whereas what we can see here is we are in a world with perfectly flexible prices in this particular example. The price hasn't changed, but it's not because it's sticky. It's an equilibrium result coming from the highly elastic demands. And of course, we don't have to go to an extreme of commodities. There are many producers in developing, emerging, and even advanced economies that are closer to commodity exporters in that they face quite elastic demands and their prices tend to be flexible. So this is illustrated in this chart here. There is some monopoly power, but the elasticity of demand is high. Again, let's ask what happens with a depreciation of the exchange rate. The price changes very little, so it appears also a bit sticky. There's very little change, but quantities can expand by a lot. The limit here for the export expansion is given by supply, not by demand. Just to recap here, in the dominant currency pricing model, with monopoly power and sticky dollar prices, an exchange rate depreciation does not affect export prices or quantities. Monetary policy in this setting has very little impact, and having a flexible exchange rate regime doesn't really help. Instead, in the mixed currency pricing model that I showed you, with more elastic demands and flexible prices, an exchange rate depreciation, again, does not affect the price of exports in equilibrium, but it can cause a large increase in export quantities. And in this setting, monetary policy can have a large impact. So in a way, this mixed currency pricing model restores the quantity result or quantity responses that we had in our minds from the producer currency pricing literature, while still featuring limited pass-through to dollar export prices. So 3 things I'd like to emphasize here. First, as we've seen, there's a large share of trade that is invoicing a few vehicle currencies, and within that, the dollar plays a huge role. But using a vehicle currency for pricing or invoicing does not imply sticky prices or monopoly powers. On the contrary, if anything, I show you the empirical evidence suggests that the opposite is the case. The use of the dollar is more likely in competitive, homogeneous goods markets where prices are flexible. The second point I'd like to emphasize is this point on the empirical interpretation of the data. The lack of pass-through to prices from exchange rate depreciation doesn't necessarily mean that prices are sticky. Again, commodities are the extreme example for that, but we can see that in other settings with very elastic demands. And this second point is important because it was, in some sense, the argument for displacing producer currency pricing and moving towards dominant currency pricing. The observation that prices in dollars were sticky and unresponsive to exchange rates. And the last point is, well, obvious by now, these small differences in assumptions can be hugely consequential for the impact of monetary policy and the advice that we give to developing and emerging economies. So let me show you some data. I will emphasize 3 empirical observations. The first one is that homogeneous products represent a large share of exports for many countries. Here, when I say homogeneous, I use a classification of RAW, where homogeneous goods are those sold in organized markets or using a reference price. Here we see that more than 70% of developing countries' exports are homogeneous goods. For the average emerging economy, the share of homogeneous goods is above 60%. For the average advanced economy, it is in the order of 35%. Actually, amongst advanced economies, there's huge dispersion because you have countries like Canada, Norway, Australia, New Zealand, where this share is very, very high, and I think I'm plotting Norway here, and countries that are in the other extreme, as you can see, France and Germany in particular, where the share of homogeneous goods is just around 20%. So huge dispersion in advanced economies. The second observation, I mean, I don't think I need to tell you that commodity prices move every second as I speak. And, so these are very markets with very flexible prices, but to the extent that it's not just about extreme commodities, what we observe in the work of many scholars across countries and over time is that homogeneous goods systematically tend to have very flexible prices. And I'm here giving one example, documenting that the duration in months of differentiated goods prices is 10 to around 10 times, that of the duration of homogeneous goods markets. So there is very high flexibility in homogeneous goods markets. And the third fact to highlight is that invoicing in vehicle currencies or in the dollar, in the US dollar, is more prevalent in homogeneous goods sectors. And this is a point that McKinnon had made back in the 70s, Carson Wood as well. There's a very nice paper by Baketan Van Winkop trying to make sense of these choices. And the idea here is that producers with very low market power selling in these homogeneous goods markets will want to be follow very closely the competitive prices in global markets, so they will prefer to price in dollars or in a vehicle currency. We corroborate this, and also just a point on Linda Goldberg and Cedric Thiel's paper. They show, using microdata for Canada, that dollar pricing is much more likely for exporters that sell in homogeneous goods markets or have low market shares. Now, we corroborate this by looking at a panel of countries since the 1980s, and this is portrayed in this regression table. Countries with a larger share of homogeneous goods in their export base tend to have a higher share of exports invoiced in dollars. And the association is very, very, very tight. For every 10 percentage point increase in the share of homogeneous goods in exports, the share of exports invoiced in dollars increases by something like 7 to 8 percentage points. What we do next is to put together a structural model that nests different pricing assumptions, and it can help us to explore the implications of monetary policy in a more rigorous way and with a more rigorous quantitative angle. So we study a new Keynesian model that, as I said, nests the different configurations for nominal frictions, from nominal currency pricing to producer currency pricing, and the mixed currency pricing alternative that we are suggesting here that gives more flexibility. When it comes to production and competition, the model has a much more flexible market structure that allows for intra-sectoral international competition, as well as heterogeneity in the degree of price stickiness. And here we use a nesting of goods that is different from the standard international finance model. It's closer to the trade model that trade economists use. So potentially there's a lot, there can be a very high elasticity of substitution across different varieties of the same goods, and that competition can happen cross borders rather than the international finance assumption that there is a composite national good traded across borders. So in this framework, we can allow for higher substitutability across different varieties in certain sectors, and lower elasticities across the broader sectors or goods. For wage and price settings, across a specification that we explore, we will assume some rigidity in wages and non-tradable inputs. And for export prices, as I said, we will explore the different variants, including the variant with flexible prices. Now, we assume that the central bank in this model follows a Taylor rule that targets inflation. And what we do in the paper is explore what happens if there is a monetary policy change that is exogenous. So I changed to this mu here. We explore how that transmits to the rest of the economy. And I'm not showing you the model, but the first effect that this will have, if we're looking at expansionary monetary policies, that will lead to a depreciation of the exchange rate. And let me just show you the headline picture in the paper. So this shows what happens when there is a loosening of monetary policy that causes a depreciation of the exchange rate. So, oops, sorry, I didn't want to go there. So you can see here the three configurations, PCP, or producer currency pricing, which is a dashed black line, dominant currency pricing in blue, and the mixed currency pricing in red. So let me start with the producer currency pricing. When there is a depreciation caused by the monetary policy intervention, export prices fall, and they fall 1-for-1 with the exchange rate depreciation. And again, this is Friedman's word and the canonical of Rogoff. So that's on the right. And what we see is that export quantities respond to that fall in exports. Exports expand, and we see this expenditure switching there. And the magnitude is driven by the demand elasticity, which is here assumed to be 2, which is the standard in this literature. Now, what happens in the dominant currency paradigm model? Well, here, when there is a depreciation of the exchange rate, the export price barely changes. So it appears, the blue line that you see here, export prices don't change. And as a consequence, export quantities do not change either. And this is the graph I showed you at the beginning of the monopolies with sticky prices. And the last calibration, which we think is relevant for emerging and developing countries, is the one in red. Here we use the elasticities for homogeneous goods from Broad and Weinstein, and I think some similar picture would emerge from Isabel Mejan and Janim's work. So in here, again, in equilibrium, export prices won't change. The demand elasticities are very high, but export quantities change as much as in, or even more actually in this calibration, than in the producer currency pricing world. Now, I'm not going to discuss the rest of the impulse responses, but let me show you in this table some sense of the magnitudes. Here, we're looking at the impact of a loosening in the order of 1 percentage point. So it's a cut in the policy interest rate of 1 percentage point that leads to a depreciation of 36 basis points here across all models. In the PCP, which is the first column here, we see that dollar export prices fall very close to the depreciation in the exchange rate, and export quantities, as well as more broadly output, increase. In the middle case, dominant currency pricing, the depreciation doesn't lead to any change in export prices, and export quantities also barely move. And in the far right, you see the mixed currency pricing calibration, where we see that, again, these are the numbers a year after the policy intervention. We see that, again, export prices don't change much, but quantities increase insignificantly. So we do a number of robustness checks in the model, interrogating the model. I think what's interesting when we try to calibrate more advanced economies, so the model is obviously very flexible, not just for developing or emerging economies. When we look at advanced economies and we embed the assumption that they tend to use producer currency pricing and there's more stickiness there, we get the similar responses as we get in the mixed currency pricing model. So again, we're back to Obstfeld, Rogoff, and the conclusion that exchange rates do move quantities in there. Okay, so the key difference then, and let me just, to fix ideas between dominant currency pricing and mixed currency pricing, again in the calibration for emerging and developing countries, is that DCP assumes very or high market power and inelastic demands. We are assuming low market power and highly elastic demand curves. Export prices are sticky in the dominant currency paradigm. Here they are flexible. Both models generate low pass-through to export prices. The key difference comes in the implications for quantities, and this is what we do next, look at the predictions of the model in terms of quantities. So let me just summarize here what we find. We carry out the same exercise that we did in the theoretical exercise. We carried out with data, and we used 2 countries, Canada and Chile, which are main exporters of commodities. And what we find there is that following an exchange rate appreciation, here I'm flipping the sign, so we have a tightening in monetary policy that leads to an appreciation. So in both countries, we confirm that export volumes fall. That happens across all sectors. Commodity exports sectors react more quickly, whereas the non-commodity sectors take a little bit longer to respond. Broader activity, whether we look at GDP or industrial production, also falls, unemployment increases, and inflation falls. So sometimes, I mean, so one reason why we focus here on Chile, I should say, is that we have a longer time series with a more stable regime to be able to study monetary policy shocks and be more confident about the identification. What we do also is look at 3 case studies of countries that had large devaluations, so Argentina in 2001, Mexico during the tequila crisis, and Brazil in 1998. So we look at what happens to their exports relative to US exports to have a way of benchmarking. And what we find is that following this very large depreciation, exports expand relative to the trend, whether that trend is US exports or global exports. And so this is, again, confirming the intuition that comes from the model that exchange rates can have a very large effect. Now, of course, exchange rate devaluations are not exogenous, but here the endogeneity of exchange rates will tend to act against finding any effect because we tend to devaluate or depreciate the currency when exports are going down rather than up. So we're very confident that this is actually a big boost to exports. And what we do next is look at, again, given the fact that the time series for most developing and emerging countries are fairly short, where we can do proper identification, we pull the data together in a panel using the database of Randao, Marquez, and co-authors from the IMF. And we do, again, the same exercise, looking at the impact of monetary policy interventions. and look at what happens to different economic variables. So here you can see, again, I'm looking at a tightening of the policy rate, which appreciates the exchange rate. Here, an increase in the exchange rate is an appreciation. And that leads to a fall in export values, which means that export quantities would fall even more given the appreciation. Industrial production falls, and CPI inflation also falls. So again, all this is consistent with what the model would have to, with the mixed currency pricing calibration would tell us. So just to summarize here, the policy conclusions from the dominant currency paradigm rely on 2 premises that are not borne out by the data: the monopoly power jointly with sticky dollar prices. We tend to see use of the dollar or vehicle currency in markets that are competitive and where prices tend to be flexible. What we do here is propose a more general framework which allows for greater competition and price flexibility. It can be calibrated in different ways to fit fit to different countries' circumstances and conditions. So one can play a lot with the model and given its flexibility. And as I said, in this model, we get large quantity effects, as in the PCP literature, with limited impact on export prices. So going back to my initial question, can monetary policy help? Yes, it can help stabilize demand around potential, even when the dollar is used as the main invoice currency in export markets. Exchange rates do act as automatic stabilizers, and we show evidence consistent with that from large devaluations and identified monetary policy shocks. Now, let me just go a little bit outside the model now. So what I showed you or argue that is a monetary policy can be effective at stabilizing demand around supply potential. But of course, what we are concerned now is about change, or these days, is changes in that potential. And for that, there's nothing that monetary policy can do. Monetary policy, at best, can bring inflation back to target over a reasonable period of time, given lags, and stabilize demand around potential, but that's it. It cannot really fix the energy crisis or deal with floods and so on and so forth. So we really need to think about a real-side policy strategy that helps prevent, mitigate, and cope with supply shocks. If we think about most of the growth setbacks that we've had, particularly in Europe in recent years, they were driven by shocks for which we were not prepared for, whether it was a pandemic or the increase in energy prices following the invasion of Ukraine. So when I think about such a strategy, I think about three main pillars. The first one is more investment on technological diversification, particularly on inputs or technologies that are critical and have low substitutability. And Miklos and I have done some work on that, and now there's some amazing work on this going on. The second pillar, and I think when we see good examples of this, I mean, during the energy crisis in Europe, Switzerland was super ready to shift from gas and oil to hydropower, solar, wind. I mean, they were prepared, and that cannot be said about other countries in Europe. The second pillar should be deeper integration with countries with low geopolitical risk. This will help us lower exposure to domestic shocks, as well as to specific input suppliers and buyers, and that would help reduce volatility and the impact of shocks. Reshoring is not a solution to build resilience. We need to keep that integration, and again, particularly with countries that are reliable and have low geopolitical risk. And the third element in that pillar in that strategy should be to, again, drawing the comparisons from the financial system and what we learn from that literature, is to build buffers, and that can help us prepare for, at least for a period of time when we can resort to more substitution, to deal with shortages in critical inputs, whether it's energy, water, rare earths these days, and so forth. So I'll pause here, and I'm happy to get questions, and thank you again.
So thank you so much, Silvana. That was a crash course in a lot of the great things that you've worked on. For the non-economists in the room, certainly a crash course in international economics and monetary policy. You have two generations, if I may say so, Cam, of Bernhard Harms Prize winners on the podium. We can collect a few questions to both of them. So I would think that some of you, Elaine breaks the ice, and over there, the gentleman.
And I wonder if you have explored a bit further, so conditional on monetary policy shock, so that gives you very different implication for the volatility of current accounts of countries depending on their export composition, whether they are more commodity exporters or not, and that is very important, obviously, also for the dynamic of the current account and the way it is financed, etc. So I think there's a further kind of a research agenda there. Have you looked at it a little bit?
You want to take the mic? Should we collect the second question?
Just a question. Over the last multiple months, there's been more extraordinary attention to stablecoins. How does that change the dynamic that you worked on? Just some broad thoughts on that, if you have some time.
Great, I think that's perfect. We have maybe a question each.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, we do explore the implications for the current account to the extent that we look at exports and imports in the paper, but there's a lot more work to do and in understanding these dynamics. So I think as a first pass, I would say that the current account doesn't change a lot. What we see is, say, with the depreciation, exports expand a lot, and eventually imports too, because the whole broader activity increases. So in equilibrium, we don't see much, neither in the model nor in the empirics. But it's definitely something to look more carefully, and also to think about what happens when many countries are playing with monetary policy, and so there's a lot more to do, definitely. Do you want to take the stable coins, or?
Well, I mean, I think it's a different topic, more about the financial market and less about pricing. I mean, the extent we have information about it, there's certainly a long history of dollarization of different types, and how countries deal with that and how it affects their monetary policy. And we actually have a student on the market who's very good this year, Sage Belts. She's going to be a star who has a paper on this.
Well, just say that in the same way as monetary policy is a small piece of the story, I think with stable coins we should be also worrying about the real consequences. And Ken mentioned today the informality, and that's a very important thing. I mean, to the extent that stable coins lead to tax evasion or illegal activities. I mean, that's a first order macro issue. From the perspective of monetary policy, I think what we would conclude, if these transactions take place in stable coins, which are mostly denominated in dollars, we would say, okay, the effect is still there. The impact of monetary policy will not be reduced by the fact that you are paying with stable coins rather than with other payment methods. So from that side, the monetary policy side, I'm not too concerned. I'm a lot more concerned about the fiscal repercussions of stable coins in terms of evasion and illegality.
Great, then let me suggest that we conclude here, continue the conversation outside, and let us thank again Silvana. Congratulations.